Welcome to SAIS Johns Hopkins University, and welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, and also to, and this is something very special for us, our Reischauer Memorial Lecture. We have today someone who I think is one of the most appropriate people that I can imagine to serve as a Reischauer Memorial Lecture. He was, of course, a direct student of Edwin Reischauer. He wrote his senior thesis with Professor Reischauer. And also, I have to say very warmly, was a student in some ways of mine. I still remember when Ken was a sophomore at Harvard College, down in Quincy House, as I was a sophomore tutor at that point. And meeting him for the first time, I could tell how organized he was, how much energy he had. And I thought, this person is headed for big things. It's one of the real pleasures of an academic as time goes by, particularly to be able to see one's students and the people that one's known grow and prosper. And I think that certainly has been the case with Ken. It's been very special to see it. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard. Then he went on to Harvard Law School. After law school, he became a partner of Arnold and Porter, one of the most prominent firms in Washington, D.C. Then he went into government service. He served as deputy, and I can remember when he was serving as the acting senior counselor to Larry Eagleburger as Secretary of State. And then later on as Undersecretary of Commerce, and then also Deputy Director in later years. And there are many other things that I could add. Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, and then most recently, Ambassador to India. At the Reischauer Center, of course, one of our major concerns, of course, we're a Center for East Asian Studies, so broad regional concerns, but particularly, of course, for Japan. And Ken has had, across his career, a tremendous interest in Japan, stemming from his mother, now 96 years old, who's here with us on the front row. So there's a great deal that I could say personally, but I think what you really want to hear, of course, is from Ambassador Juster himself about a relationship which, of course, has been distant in the past in some years, but has substantial roots that date back to classical history, and certainly in the context of the way that Eurasia has changed more recently, has become one of the most important relationships in the world. So, Ken, it's a real honor to welcome you here to SAIS. Thank you.
Okay, well, Ken, thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. And it means a tremendous amount to me because I have my mother here, and she first inspired me to be interested in East Asia from her own travels with my father. And I'm sure she appreciates your kind words every bit as much as I do. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and truly an honor to be at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies with Kent Calder to deliver the Reischauer Memorial Lecture. As Kent indicated, both he and Edwin Reischauer played an important role in the formative years of my intellectual development, such as that might be. Almost 50 years ago, when I was a sophomore at Harvard in the early 1970s, Kent was a graduate student in the government department and led a small tutorial group on East Asia in which I participated. I had come to college with an interest in this region because I had been an AFS exchange student in Thailand in high school. Kent, who has made very significant contributions to the scholarship on East Asia through his numerous writings, taught me how to think clearly and analytically. I met Professor Reischauer during my sophomore year as well when I took his Gov 180 course on Japanese politics. What a knowledgeable and inspiring teacher he was. He was also a legendary U.S. ambassador to Japan, serving from 1961 to 1966. He thus brought an academic rigor to his diplomacy and real-world experience to his scholarship, a noteworthy combination that made him more effective in both pursuits. After taking Professor Reischauer's course, I found the courage to ask him if I could do an independent study with him during my junior year, and he graciously said yes. Professor Reischauer, as Ken said, subsequently served as an advisor for my senior thesis on Japanese foreign policy making during the oil crisis of 1972 to 1973, and I benefited greatly from his wise counsel. In short, my many positive memories of my engagement with Kent Calder and Ed Reischauer makes delivering the Reischauer Memorial Lecture a very special honor for me. Professor Reischauer's academic focus was Japan and East Asia. I do not recall him ever mentioning India or, more broadly, the concept of the Indo-Pacific in his course or in our conversations. Today, of course, there is great focus on the Indo-Pacific region, which stretches from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the United States. In fact, the Indo-Pacific contains the most populous countries in the world and is home to more than half of the global population. It has the world's largest and fastest growing economies and countries with some of the most powerful militaries. According to various measures, approximately 50% of global trade goes through its waters. I think it's fair to say, therefore, that the Indo-Pacific has emerged as the most dynamic region in the world. This has certainly been reflected in the evolution of U.S. government policy. In its 2017 National Security Strategy, the U.S. government replaced the term Asia-Pacific with Indo-Pacific and committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific. The following year, the United States changed the name of the Military Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command. Most Americans view the Indo-Pacific through the lens of the U.S. government's role in defining and shaping this region in conjunction with its allies and partners. But as many in this room know, that perspective misses the essential role that Japan, particularly under its late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, played in developing the concept of the Indo-Pacific and in working with India to advance it. In light of my recent tenure as U.S. Ambassador to India, I'd like to focus today on the Japan-India relationship and make the case that this relationship is vital to the architecture of the Indo-Pacific and indeed to U.S. interests in the region. Specifically, I will discuss the central role of former Prime Minister Abe in developing the concept of the Indo-Pacific, the strategic significance of the Japan-India relationship, and the key challenges and opportunities for the partnership in the areas of trade, investment, infrastructure, defense, and diplomacy. The links between Japan and India go back centuries, highlighted by the spread of Buddhism from the subcontinent across Asia. But the formal ties that would eventually form a key pillar of the Indo-Pacific region began in 1952, when Japan signed a peace treaty with India establishing diplomatic relations, shortly after Japan itself had regained its post-war sovereignty. While the two countries generally maintained cordial relations during the Cold War, they were largely in different geopolitical camps. Japan's priority was its security and economic relationship with the United States, while India was a leader of the non-aligned movement and closer to the Soviet Union. Japan also pursued an export-oriented economic agenda, while India pursued autarky. With the end of the Cold War and in the midst of a severe financial crisis, India sought economic assistance from Japan and others in 1991. Soon the two countries began to develop closer ties. This cooperation suffered a setback, however, in 1998, when India's nuclear tests led to strong criticism and sanctions from much of the world, including Japan, given its own sensitivity to nuclear weapons. However, shortly after President Bill Clinton took an historic trip to India in 2000, Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori made a similarly significant trip to India. This helped warm relations between the two Asian powers as they agreed to begin a global partnership. A few years later, during the first administration of Prime Minister Abe in 2006, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh visited Japan. There, the two institutionalized prime ministerial talks and elevated their ties to a strategic and global partnership, a specific term the two countries use for key relationships. The next year, Prime Minister Abe visited India. He was following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who in 1957 had been the first post-war Japanese prime minister to visit an independent India. During Abe's 2007 visit, he delivered a seminal speech in the Indian Parliament entitled The Confluence Between the Two Seas. Early in my tenure as ambassador, one of India's senior political figures told me that Abe's speech was masterful in its appeal to an Indian audience. He urged me to study it, and so I did. Abe envisioned the Pacific and the Indian Oceans as a dynamic coupling as seas of freedom and prosperity, referencing the book that the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh authored in India in 1655 on the confluence of the two seas. Abe asserted that Japan has rediscovered India as a partner that shares the same values and interests, and also as a friend that will work alongside us. He noted that as maritime states, both India and Japan have vital interests in the security of sea lanes, and he added that a strong India is in the best interest of Japan, and a strong Japan is in the best interest of India. Abe's speech laid the foundation for his vision of a broader Asia, an immense network that would be open and transparent, allowing people, goods, capital, and knowledge to flow freely. Shortly after Abe was unfortunately murdered in 2022, he wrote an op-ed recounting his famous address to the Indian Parliament. It was shortly before he was murdered. In his words, I departed from the Asia-Pacific idea and introduced a new geopolitical concept that envisaged the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as one free sea. Bearing in mind China's efforts to become a military superpower, I also sought cooperation with countries in Asia that shared basic values, as well as an alignment among Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. In essence, Abe knew that India was bound to become a leading power, and he recognized the benefits of including this major democracy in the structure of Asian geopolitics. He also encouraged Indians to join his vision of the Indo-Pacific, boosting their own perception of India's role in the region. During Abe's second administration in 2016, he formally announced the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific at the Tokyo International Conference on African Development in Nairobi. This concept converged with India's Act East policy, which is its focus on economic, strategic, and cultural relations with the countries of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the broader Asia-Pacific region. Soon, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which emphasizes the importance of treating the land and maritime areas of the major oceans as a single strategic space became integrated into Indian as well as American thinking. Abe developed a close relationship with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, just as he had done with Prime Minister Singh. In 2015, Prime Minister Modi declared that no other strategic partnership can exercise a more profound influence on shaping the course of Asia and our interlinked ocean regions. When the leaders met in December of that year, they issued a joint statement that further upgraded the bilateral relationship to a special strategic and global partnership. Japan's foreign minister at the time was Fumio Kishida, who is Prime Minister today. Speaking in this auditorium just 2 months ago, Prime Minister Kishida noted the importance of Japan's relationship with India and his intention to enhance that partnership in pursuit of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Tokyo-Delhi partnership is strategically significant to the Indo-Pacific and to U.S. interests for several reasons. Though Japan and India are two of the largest and most powerful democracies in the region, neither seeks to be a hegemon. In fact, they share a common vision for the region that respects sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rules-based order, and supports the freedom of trade, navigation, and overflight so that all can prosper. Both Japan and India have long-standing territorial disputes with China that have heated up in recent years. In the case of India, which has a more than 2,000-mile border, undefined border with China, they have been military standoffs in Doklam in 2017, Ladakh in 2020, and the Tawang region in 2022. In the case of Japan, China has taken more assertive action in the East China Sea regarding Japan's claim of sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands. Japan and India have also grown increasingly wary of the geopolitical strategy behind China's Belt and Road Initiative, known as BRI, and Chinese tactics such as predatory financing, which has often imposed unsustainable debt burdens on recipient countries. India opposed BRI from the outset and refused to participate in the first Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. While China initially supported BRI, it continues to champion its own alternative to it, the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. Accordingly, the governments of Japan and India are each departing from their cautious foreign policies to address the rise of China and to seek to prevent the emergence of a new expansionist hegemonic power in the region. Both seek to construct a stable, multipolar architecture for the region by promoting alternatives to China's initiatives and policies without necessarily disengaging from the Chinese economy. And each views the other as central to its efforts to confront this strategic challenge. Yet, as a matter of historical experience and national principle, India resists alliances. Abe's genius, therefore, in developing the concept of the Indo-Pacific was to lay the foundation for drawing India into institutionalized cooperation with Japan, the United States, and Australia in what is known as the Quad. The Quad is a unique grouping of three allies, Japan, the United States, and Australia, and one strategic partner, India. It was formed in 2007, but the critics labeled it an Asian NATO, and Chinese protests led to its disbanding in 2008. 9 years later, in 2017, Japan and the United States led the effort to revitalize the Quad, first at the working level, then with ministerial meetings, and more recently with leadership summits. The Quad is careful not to focus explicitly on security issues, nor to invoke publicly the name of China. But as China's military activity on India's northern border has become increasingly aggressive, India has become more comfortable coordinating activities with the three Quad allies. These have been primarily in non-controversial areas that promote a positive agenda for the region, such as vaccine distribution, resilient supply chains, critical and emerging technologies, maritime domain awareness, and humanitarian relief. At the same time, India's longstanding resistance to the involvement of third countries in its neighborhood is gradually giving way to cooperation with Japan and the United States, among others, in managing regional challenges, including through joint military exercises. A strong Japan-India relationship is a critical component of the Quad. India's pursuit of strategic autonomy may make it reluctant at times to coordinate too closely with the United States, perhaps so not to be seen as a junior partner. For India, Japan is a less conspicuous partner than the United States, and it may well be easier for Delhi to work together with Tokyo in some areas. I believe that such initiatives will usually be consistent with U.S. interests and thus worthy of U.S. support, even if it is not directly involved. Among the benefits, the activities of Japan and India working in tandem may seem a bit less alarming to China or to other countries in the region than similar activities would be that involve the United States. The fact is that however important the Indo-Pacific region is to the United States, America has global commitments and needs others to share certain burdens. The Japan-India partnership does just that, especially in terms of maritime capabilities and support for the smaller countries in the region. In essence, the United States is gradually moving away from the hub and spoke system of alliances to what the U.S. national security strategy now calls a latticework of strong, resilient, and mutually enforcing relationships with allies and partners, such as in the Quad, that can take on greater regional responsibilities, thereby reducing the burden on the United States. Finally, I think it's fair to say that Japan and India may well be more culturally sensitive than the United States and may have a softer touch with their Indo-Pacific counterparts. As we all know, America's focus at times on human rights or economic sanctions can irritate other countries. Moreover, the smaller nations of the Indo-Pacific, especially those in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, do not want to have to choose between China and the United States or be caught up in a new Cold War. Japan and India can more comfortably work with these countries, removed from the context of the US-China rivalry. Let me now turn to some of the key challenges and opportunities over the next few years for the Japan-India partnership. First, I will focus on economic cooperation, which has been central to the bilateral relationship and can have a positive impact more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. This includes trade, investment, and infrastructure. Second, there is potential for strategic cooperation in defense and diplomacy, as each country undergoes significant internal changes in these areas with profound consequences for the region. The economic relationship between Japan and India today is positive but modest. The complementary structures and strengths of the two countries suggest the possibility of significant returns from greater economic engagement. I believe there is the political will in Tokyo and Delhi to make this happen, both to add ballast to the strategic relationship and to avoid economic dependency on China. Let's start with trade, where the foundation of the relationship between Japan and India is their Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. This agreement came into effect in 2011 and provided for tariff reductions on approximately 90% of goods traded between the two countries. While there was substantial growth in bilateral trade during the first couple of years of CEPA implementation, from approximately $13 billion a year to almost $19 billion, bilateral trade then decreased over the next few years and now largely fluctuates between those two figures. For the world's third and fifth largest economies, these trade flows fall short of their potential. An expanded trade relationship for the two countries makes sense on its own terms, but also as part of Japan and India's response to China's robust regional economic agenda. The two countries cannot help but notice how China has used its economic influence in the Indo-Pacific to advance its bilateral and regional political goals. China was one of the first countries to ratify the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which was also signed by the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. India had been part of the negotiations, but eventually withdrew in 2019, shortly before the signing. China is the largest trading partner with virtually every RCEP country. This makes China the regional economic center and the country best positioned to dominate regional supply chains. China has also unexpectedly submitted a formal application in 2021 to join the other major regional trade arrangement, the High Standards Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. A lot of letters here. In 2017, the United States abruptly withdrew from the predecessor of this pact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but under Japanese leadership, the remaining 11 signatories revived the agreement and created the successor CPTPP. In addition, China has applied to join the Regional Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, currently involving Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, which is aimed at facilitating digital trade. It is clear from all of these initiatives that China is seeking to shape the rules for trade and investment while promoting integration with its neighbors and increasing their dependence on Beijing. Japan and India, as well as the United States, would benefit, in my view, from a coordinated trade strategy to compete with China and to address the critical importance that countries in the region place on economic issues. For these reasons, the United States launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, in 2022. One of IPEF's 4 pillars is fair and resilient trade. While 13 countries, including Japan and India, have joined the IPEF initiative, India has decided for now not to be part of the trade pillar. Moreover, Washington has announced that issues of market access are not on the table. Perhaps this position will be modified over time, but the lack of greater access to the U.S. market may well mute the enthusiasm of Asia participants in IPEF and reduce the likelihood of a significant trade arrangement being implemented under it. For Japan and India, the first step in a trade strategy would be to update their bilateral trade agreement. Beyond that, and despite India's preference for bilateral agreements, I believe the two countries should work on common trade concerns in the Quad. After all, every Quad member has a bilateral agreement with the other, except for the United States and India. While Quad members are not in sync on all trade issues, the existing bilateral agreements among the parties provide the foundation for the Quad to adopt a building block approach by beginning to address select matters of interest, such as trade facilitation and liberalization of the services sectors. Because trade is both strategic and filled with esoteric detail, trade negotiators would benefit from having Quad leaders engaged to help them make the tough political decisions. Leaders could delicately provide the impetus for a pragmatic plan on trade to help shape the regional architecture and perhaps expand it over time to include other countries in the region. India and others should appreciate the importance of such regional measures in structuring alternative supply chains, reducing vulnerabilities associated with relying on China for inputs and raw materials, and shaping the norms and standards for the digital economy. In some respects, Japan may be better suited than the United States to play a leading role on digital matters because, unlike America, it is not affected by the controversial issues surrounding many of the large U.S. high-tech companies. Let me now turn to development assistance and investments in infrastructure, a positive story that reflects bilateral goodwill and the potential for cooperation in third countries. Japan has been providing official development assistance, known as ODA, to India since 1958. Over the past 2 decades, India has been among the largest recipients of ODA from the Japan International Cooperation Agency, as well as a major recipient of lending from Japan's Bank for International Cooperation, or JBIC. JBIC has financed several major infrastructure projects in India. These include the construction of the Delhi Metro, substantial work on the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, and support for the construction of India's first high-speed train rail from Mumbai to Ahmedabad. India has also welcomed Japan as a partner for the construction of strategically important highways and bridges in India's underdeveloped Northeast region. This is significant because India had initially not invited countries to invest in this sensitive region, which is situated above the Bay of Bengal, where local conflicts have sometimes complicated government and private projects. This area is where India's Act East policy converges with Japan's vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, connecting India and Southeast Asia. In fact, Delhi and Tokyo have created the Act East Forum as a platform to collaborate in India's Northeast region. The emergence of Japan as a key partner in Northeast India demonstrates the trust between the two countries and has played an important role in strengthening their bilateral relationship. The infrastructure projects there, which improve connectivity in the region, include the construction of a 19-kilometer bridge over the Brahmaputra River to connect the states of Assam and Meghalaya. There are other opportunities both in India and the surrounding region for strategically employing Japanese grants and JBIC funding. One leading commentator, for example, has noted the possibility of jointly developing civilian air and seaport infrastructure in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This Indian archipelago is situated at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, a critical position in the Bay of Bengal for shipping and a possible military chokehold. Japan and India share an interest in securing safe passage in this strategic location, especially as India increasingly projects its naval assets in this area. Moreover, the Indian subsidiary of Japan's NEC Corporation recently completed an optical submarine cable between Chennai and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, thereby expanding internet service for the people on the islands. Japan and India should also continue to work together on projects in third countries in the region. This includes efforts in Bangladesh involving the construction of roads and bridges, and in Sri Lanka involving the infrastructure for imports of liquefied natural gas. In addition, there is a joint effort by Tokyo and Delhi in East Africa, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, to work with others to enhance quality infrastructure and connectivity in this part of the region, in part to balance China's extensive outlays under BRI. Beyond development assistance in infrastructure and connectivity, there is substantial room for cooperation among Japan, India, and the ASEAN countries in building resilient supply chains. Japanese and Indian firms both have a way to go in diversifying their manufacturing and supply chains away from China. Japan can combine its capital and technology with India's highly skilled manpower to develop new manufacturing and production hubs in India to serve the region and beyond. Moving to defense and diplomacy, despite different geopolitical positions during the Cold War, Japan and India have increasingly found common cause in recent years. This has been driven in large part by their shared strategic clarity regarding China's aggressive military activity and predatory economic tactics in the Indo-Pacific. As a result, both countries have become more ambitious in their foreign and defense policies, including their cooperation with each other. Japan recently adopted a new national security strategy, national defense strategy, and national defense buildup program, with the goal of significantly increasing defense spending over the next 5 years so that it reaches 2% of GDP. This would roughly double what Japan has been spending and likely make its defense budget the third largest in the world. As a central element of its strategy to deter attacks from China and North Korea, Japan plans to develop counter-strike capabilities in addition to its missile defense systems. This includes building its own long-range missiles and the interim purchasing U.S. Tomahawks. Tokyo's strategy also emphasizes the importance of enhancing security cooperation with allies and like-minded countries such as India. All of this represents a substantial policy change and a welcome development. India is seeking to build up its defense forces as well, primarily in response to tensions with China, but also to protect its economic, humanitarian, and other interests. India's defense spending has increased steadily over the last several years, though a significant amount of its military budget goes to personnel costs, with a lesser amount going to capital expenditures on military arms and systems. To strengthen its forces on the border with China, India has redeployed 6 army divisions from its northwestern border with traditional foe Pakistan. It has also created a powerful chief of defense staff position and started to realign its military commands. In terms of defense equipment, India's need to diversify away from its heavy dependence on Russian arms will inevitably be accelerated by the significant military losses Russia has suffered in its invasion of Ukraine and the multilateral sanctions against Moscow. Delhi's priority is to build up its domestic manufacturing capability and develop an indigenous military-industrial complex. Even with assistance from the United States and other companies, from U.S. and other companies willing to co-produce military items in India, this indigenization effort will take time. In fact, some commentators wonder whether Make in India may hamper India's immediate efforts to modernize its forces and perhaps leave it with lower operational readiness in the short term. Tokyo and Delhi should welcome each other's military efforts. There is also room for them to expand their bilateral defense cooperation. Maritime domain awareness and coordination are extremely important to the two countries, as well as to the region more broadly. Japan and India are heavily dependent on imported energy sources. They therefore rely on significant energy flow and commercial trade that goes through the Strait of Hormuz to the west of India and the Malacca Strait to its east. The safety and security of these sea lines of communication are directly linked to the economic well-being of Japan, India, and many other countries. Accordingly, Delhi and Tokyo's naval forces have cooperated extensively over the years and have engaged in increasingly complex bilateral and multilateral naval exercises. The two countries have also signed a logistics agreement providing for their militaries to access each other's bases for support and services. And they recently agreed to step up coordination between their air forces, including their inaugural Air Force fighter exercise, which will provide a greater degree of collaboration and interoperability between the two air services. The availability of advanced military technology from Japan could play an important role in the bilateral relationship. Both countries have spoken about the prospect of defense sales by Japan to India. There are reports that the Japanese had hoped to assist India in modernizing its military capabilities through the sale of its amphibious aircraft and diesel-electric attack submarines. But pricing issues, among other concerns, seem to have kept this from happening. Japan is now in discussion with India on the possible transfer of stealth antennas for naval destroyers. India would also like Japanese companies to invest in India's defense corridors and pursue joint production of defense equipment in India. However, despite the political commitment to strengthen these ties, private sector companies have been cautious about participating in this effort. The Japanese defense sector is generally reluctant to participate in global defense markets without government-to-government programs and is sensitive to the extremely competitive defense procurement process in India, which is also beset with complicated bureaucratic procedures and offset guidelines. Another irritant involves Russia, which is a friend of India but an adversary of Japan. Tokyo still seeks a solution to its longstanding claim that against Moscow over the four southernmost Kuril Islands, which Moscow has controlled since the end of World War II. The Japanese therefore did not appreciate India's participation in a September 2022 military exercise with Russia and China close to these disputed islands. In addition, India's refusal to publicly condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its increased purchases of oil from Moscow is at odds with Japan's strong condemnation of the invasion and its active support of sanctions to isolate Russia. These differences are a manifestation of India's current dependence on Russian arms and spare parts, as well as its emphasis on strategic autonomy, both of which inhibit more formal security coordination with Japan and others, including the United States. Nonetheless, the Japan-India defense relationship continues to grow, especially in terms of military exercises. This allows for a corresponding reduction in the security burden to the United States in the Indo-Pacific, a fact welcomed by Washington, which has borne a substantial portion of that burden over the years. In addition, Japan and India have expanded diplomatic cooperation in recent years. They have coordinated through a bilateral 2+2 dialogue among defense and foreign ministers, and in multilateral venues such as the Quad, as well as work together on the ground in third countries. This helps the two democratic powers exchange information and find common approaches on China and on places such as Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and North Korea. Tokyo and Delhi could do more together to support countries in the region, perhaps through exchanges of parliamentarians, governors or mayors, judges, and academics. This would assist other countries in building stronger political, legal, and educational institutions. Japan and India could also strengthen their coordination in multilateral organizations, such as the East Asia Summit and the United Nations, to lessen the influence of China. In addition, this year presents a unique opportunity for Tokyo and Delhi to work together during their respective presidencies of the G7 and the G20. Prime Ministers Kishida and Modi are both focusing on greater engagement with the low-income countries of the so-called Global South on issues such as energy, food, climate change, and healthcare. The lead-up to the summit meetings this year could provide the occasion for Tokyo and Delhi to coordinate on the G7 and G20 agendas, including on the many challenges facing developing nations. In short, the Japan-India relationship has the potential to be even more central to the Indo-Pacific and to the world. Let me add one final thought about the drivers of the Japan-India relationship. Government institutions in Japan and India have always been very important and influential. There are also structural forces, such as the rise of China, that affect Japan-India relations. But an equally significant feature in the evolution of this partnership has been the role of political leadership. Prime Minister Abe's warm personal relationship, first with Prime Minister Singh and then with Prime Minister Modi, was critical to the adoption of the concept of the Indo-Pacific, the growth of the Japan-India partnership, and the creation of the Quad. Prime Minister Kishida is now seeking to continue that personal connection to Modi. A year ago, on his first visit to India as Prime Minister, Kishida wrote an op-ed about the tremendous dynamism of India and expressed his hope that his visit would deepen the Japan-India Special Strategic and Global Partnership even further, a sentiment that he reiterated during his speech here in January. This augurs well for the future of the Japan-India partnership as Prime Minister Kishida prepares for a visit to Delhi next week, where he is expected to invite Prime Minister Modi to participate in the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima in May. In conclusion, let me come back to the U.S. perspective on the region. The U.S. government has encouraged the Japan-India relationship, and those in the know fully appreciate its strategic significance. The Japan-India partnership is a vital strand in the latticework of mutually reinforcing relationships that the United States hopes will be integral to the architecture of the Indo-Pacific. In addition, that partnership is a key element of integrated deterrence in the region and of diplomatic coordination to preserve the rules-based order. Toward the end of his career, Professor Reischauer wrote that as Japan becomes a larger part of the world economy, it becomes more and more necessary for Japan to play a greater worldwide role and to take active stands on issues. While he could not have anticipated the many developments since then, I am confident that Edwin Reischauer would be pleased to see Japan's centrality today and its growing partnership with India. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there are just a couple of things that I personally couldn't avoid. As he was speaking. But of course, Russia is the largest arms supplier and historically a relatively positive relationship across history with India. So doesn't that significantly constrain both Japan's, obviously, the American relationship in certain ways, especially defense technology, but possibly Japan's relationship as well?
Well, this has been something that has received a lot of attention over the last year since Russia invaded Ukraine. And as I said earlier, the Quad is an unusual grouping because you have three allies and one partner. India is not an ally of either Japan or the United States, and it's had a long relationship with the Soviet Union and its successor, Russia. During the Cold War, while India was a leader of the non-aligned movement, it also signed an agreement, friendship agreement with Russia in 1971, and ended up purchasing the vast majority of its military hardware from the Soviets. Remember, this was a time when the United States was in an alliance with Pakistan, and Pakistan has actually played a key role in the opening of China by Kissinger and Nixon. So India has had this long historical relationship. It recognizes now, in my view, even though it won't publicly say so, that Russia's ability to provide it with spare parts and munitions is decreasing severely because of the losses it's suffering in Ukraine. And in addition, it just won't be in a position because of the sanctions on them and the inability of the Russians to get sophisticated technology to provide that elsewhere, so that the United States will be, so that India will be forced to move further away from Russia. And so while this is an impediment to the relationship in the defense sector between the United States and India, or Japan and India, the trends are moving in a direction such that it's going to become more incumbent upon India to work closer with the United States and Japan over time as it moves away from Russia. And I think we have to let that process play out. So it does indicate the elements of India's strategic autonomy and the limits to some of the defense coordination, but I don't think it's a longstanding impediment. I think it's a shifting position.
Gradually, an evolution.
Correct.
Another issue I know that a lot of us have an interest in is the evolution of the Quad. You alluded to that earlier, but we've seen some major structural transformations in the Quad itself, including an expansion into education. I guess Quad scholars now we have and also in pharmaceuticals that we need to cooperate and distribution to Southeast Asia and elsewhere. How do you see the Quad evolving and affecting the relationship of Japan and India?
Well, again, the Quad is a unique grouping because, as I mentioned, it doesn't involve. Oh, do I need to use that also? Okay. Sorry. Okay. Should I go back and do the previous question also? Or the Quad is a unique grouping because it is not an alliance, and India is a partner of the countries. And as I said, it at first came out of cooperation among these four countries during the tsunami of 2004. Then they formally got together in 2007, but the Chinese immediately protested and it was dubbed an Asian NATO and it disbanded. When we sought to revitalize the Quad, and I'm pleased to say Lisa Curtis is here, who played a key role in that at the White House as the senior director for South Asia and the deputy assistant to the president. When we did this, we had to start in a way that India was comfortable with. And although people don't recognize this, although it was originally called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, you'll see that it's no longer called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, it's just called the Quad, because any reference to security made the Indians uncomfortable, and they didn't want this to be viewed as, and even by, quite frankly, the Australians and the Japanese don't want this to be viewed as a security alliance or a way to contain China, at least publicly. And so the Quad agenda has begun in softer areas such as education, pharmaceuticals, supply chains, critical and emerging technologies. It was vaccine distribution, cybersecurity, issues that create a positive agenda for the region that other countries would be comfortable with, that would not be seen as confrontational, but as building something that's for the common good. Over time, there are now more than 20 working groups in the Quad, and they still are not going to get into overtly security issues, although maritime domain awareness is growing. There's now a maritime security group that came out of the last Quad ministerial meeting, which occurred just a couple of weeks ago in Delhi. And this grouping, especially as China becomes more active in its own activities in the region, is evolving. And it'll be interesting to see as to the future direction it goes. And I suggested in my talk that they might even want to get into trade, which is a difficult issue, but is critical in the region. And it's the one strategic shortcoming for the United States, in my opinion, but for all of these countries, that China really dominates the region economically. So the Quad is a very active grouping. If you saw, because the ministerial was held in Delhi, and then they had a meeting afterwards for what was called the Raisina Dialogue, and I was there, the body language between the four ministers was so comfortable, and it's really grown tremendously. And one of the differences between 2007 and today is the relationships on a bilateral basis have changed substantially among India and the United States, Japan, and Australia. And the strategic clarity they all have about the challenges they face in the region has converged as well. So I think the Quad has tremendous potential. It's a unique grouping, and it'll be interesting to see how it further expands over the years.
And then perhaps just one final question, and I know that I can see there are a number of questions bubbling up as well. But that really would have to do with this rather unique year that we have in 2023, with first the Hiroshima G7 summit in Japan, and then the G20 in India, and then the APEC Asia Pacific summit in San Francisco. So it sounds good that there are three there. There should be some possibility for coordination. What sort of issues would you suppose there might be where we might get some sort of broad consensus? Might not be the word, but at least some efficient progress as a result of that.
Well, again, it was interesting that a week ago or 2 weeks ago, when this Quad ministerial had met in Delhi, and then they had a panel before others of us, that they talked about how they are working together on discussing agenda issues amongst the Japanese, the Indians, and the Americans. Clearly, one issue that has risen to the top, and I alluded to it in my talk, was what's affecting what's now deemed to be the global South. That's a term that covers a vast number of less developed countries that in many respects you've read about recently that have suffered tremendously from Russia's war in Ukraine in terms of the impact of higher energy prices, higher food prices, fertilizer prices, and also are countries that may be severely affected by climate change. And both Japan and India have said that they want a focus of their summit meetings to be on how to address the problems of these less developed countries in the so-called global South, about 120 plus countries. And so that's been a big effort for both the G7 and the G20. I'm not sure if APEC relates to that as much, because APEC is really a regional economic cooperation grouping. Each of these forums has a slightly different focus, because the G7 is among democracies, the G20 is the largest economies, and the APEC is the economic issues in the Asia Pacific region. But I think you're going to see a lot of effort to coordinate on how these larger countries can work more effectively with the less developed world.
That was certainly a theme that Prime Minister Kishida also presented when he was here. I see a question right in the back to start, and if people could identify themselves.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Connor O'Brien. I'm an alum. I definitely jumped the gun with my hand. Sir, could you expand on to what extent the Japan-India relationship has been affected by India turning a blind eye to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And follow on that, what, if anything, do you think would cause India to formally condemn Russia, short of a nuclear bomb going off? Thank you.
Okay, well, when the invasion first occurred, people felt that India was in a bit of an uncomfortable position because it abstained at the UN, and there seemed to be a lot of questions about why India was not being more active in its denunciation of what happened. And yet somehow the Indians have been able to convert that into a situation where everyone is coming to Delhi to court India. As I said earlier, people understand some of the historical reasons for India's connection to Russia. If you look at what's happened since those initial abstentions, while they still will not publicly condemn Russia, they've made a lot of statements that have gone with the abstentions that implicitly condemn Russia. They have talked about the importance of territorial integrity, sovereignty, peaceful resolution of disputes. And in the last Quad joint statement, which came out 2 weeks ago, for the first time, these principles were actually put in the Quad statement, again, directed inevitably against Russia. Now, it's still frustrating for many that they don't explicitly state it, and it's frustrating that India, which also should be concerned about these principles in terms of its conflict with China, has publicly distanced itself. But that is just part of India's strategic autonomy, its desire to keep an avenue open to Russia. There are a variety of reasons why Russia is important to India, not just the arms relationship, but India also wants to avoid, if possible, pushing Russia any closer to China. It's true that China and Russia signed a partnership in February of last year with quote unquote no limits. But India still worries that if China is disruptive on its northern border, they want Russia to at least stay on the sidelines and not to be helping the Chinese. And then some Indians have a certain nostalgia for their relationship with Russia going back to the days of the Cold War. And Russia has been easier to deal with. For example, when the United States exports arms to countries, we have all sorts of conditions that we attach to them. We want to make sure that there are certain export controls in place, that we have what's called end-use visits. Russia is much easier in terms of dealing with. So there's a lot of different reasons why India is where it's at. As I said, I don't think they're going to publicly get down, unless if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons or does something that really crosses a red line for India. I mean, from my perspective, a lot of red lines have already been crossed, so I'm not condoning what's going on. But if it is up at the level of tactical nuclear weapons, I think you might see India publicly condemning it. They have, the Prime Minister has said, this is not a time for war. The Indians increasingly uncomfortable with the number of civilian casualties occurring in Ukraine. And so a process is happening, and if you look at the tea leaves, you can see it unfolding, but I just don't think you're going to see it explicitly stated in the way that the United States or Japan may be stating their concerns.
I see we have a question in the second row. Yeah.
It's Mark Fitzpatrick, who also goes back with me.
I'm an early member of the Ken Juster fan club
Okay.
from grad school. Ken, in your speech, you talked about the different things that Japan and India and the United States share, an interest in free trade and the geostrategic interests and so forth. And you also briefly mentioned values and democracy. And I'm just wondering if India's move away from the kind of vision that we have of democracy is a concern to the relationships, or doesn't it matter since geostrategic issues dominate?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's not a question that has a black and white answer. Democracy comes in many forms, and while U.S., Japanese, and Indian democracies at this level may be similar, at this level there are differences, and there's no doubt that there have been concerns expressed about some of the developments in India. It's an amazing country. When you step back there, the democracy in India, when I see their national elections, 700 million people come out to vote. They do it in 7 tranches. Everyone stands in line for hours. There's no absentee voting. They all have a national ID card. They all get a little piece of indelible ink on their fingers when they do it. And the elections come off without a hitch. And there's no complaints, and it's an amazing display. At the same time, what we've seen have been increased reports of religious persecutions against Muslims and Christians, of pressure on through investigations on journalists and members of civil society. And these are issues that we discuss privately with the Indians. And by the way, they discuss with us hate crimes that occur in America, beatings of Sikhs in our country, other types of religious issues. So they raise concerns with us, we raise it with them. I'm not, they're certainly taken into account. There are other interests that affect it, and there's a balance on that. At some point in any country, the issues can become so severe that they will start to tilt what other strategic concerns you have. But right now, there are issues that we discuss, but I think we feel they're best handled on a private basis than publicly.
I see a lot of hands. We are, of course, going to have a reception afterward. Hopefully, we can speak individually with Ambassador Juster. Maybe if we could take 2 or 3 final questions, and then
Do you want to take a few questions at once and then I can give?
That's
Yeah.
exactly what
Okay.
I'm thinking. First of all, one of our Indian American students who focused on Japan. I don't know, Nisha, did you have?
Thanks so much for your talk, Ambassador Jester. As someone who has a personal connection to both of these countries, I've been really looking forward to your lecture. I think as supply chains, countries around the world have moved to diversify their supply chains away from China. I think India has only captured a small percent of this diversification. What do you see as the barriers for more Japanese investment in India? And how do you see the road to alleviating those barriers?
That would be one. And then I believe we have one here. I think about right here, right? And then one from the back at some place. Yes, you can find the
Thank you. Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I might say, by the way, that per the last question, India seems to be going in the wrong direction on democracy, at least according to both Freedom House and VDEM. But
I think Freedom House has also been doing that against the United States.
Yeah.
As well.
India's not alone. Yeah. My question really, though, is about ASEAN, to introduce yet one more set of alphabetical tongue twisters. I wonder if you have any thoughts about Japan and India and their cooperation possibly in bulking up ASEAN. ASEAN's an organization that had a, quote, lot of promise, and it, quote, still does.
That's what, sorry.
Lot of promise.
Right.
And it still has a lot of promise, but so far, not a lot of results. And I wonder if India and Japan could play a part in that.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Professor. My name is Alice Zhang. I'm a DIA doctorate in international affairs student at SAIS. My question is, China is an important trade partner for both India and Japan, and each individual Quad country has their own internal interest. And you mentioned something earlier, I think both of you mentioned education and through healthcare. There are different types of partnerships. So my question is, what do you see the role that the private sector can play in addition to political efforts in developing stronger bonds between the Quad countries, at large, as well as navigating this great power competition?
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can even remember those, but we'll go back first to the issue of companies that have decided not to invest further in China. Some are closing their operations and moving elsewhere, but a number just don't do additional investment in China and looking elsewhere in the region. India was hoping to grab a large portion of that, and as was mentioned, they've gotten about 10%. It's been reported, with a fair amount going to ASEAN countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, et cetera. And the challenges for India are several-fold. It is trying to attract investment. It's created production-linked incentives to do so, but it still has an infrastructure that is subpar. It has a regulatory system that is at times unpredictable. It has some issues of labor mobility that limit its attractiveness. And it has a legal system that takes many years to resolve cases. And so these are challenges, and some companies have told me it adds maybe 10 to 15% to their costs. India is working hard to try to change these issues. It's putting a lot of money in infrastructure. It says its regulatory system will be more certain, but that still remains to be seen. And companies at the end of the day do what makes sense for the bottom line. And so, as I've told my Indian colleagues, you've got to not just talk about the changes, you've got to do them in a way that companies will think it's best for them to proceed. Now, India is such a large market. And if the China market is increasingly going to be closed out potentially, or we see this quote unquote decoupling, there's a certain inevitability about companies going to India, because even if its market is only a few 100 million people that are actively in the consumer market, that's still a large number relative to any other country. So you see a lot of companies going into India, but not full bore. And they have to do it as, I think, part of a longer run strategy, and it may not pay off immediately, but it's a place to be and an area of great growth and opportunity. And right now, it is probably still the fastest growing major economy at about 6 or 7%, but that is also coming off a large contraction after or during COVID. Okay, the next question on ASEAN. Again, ASEAN, what's interesting in the whole evolution of the Indo-Pacific concept is that the ASEAN countries were worried about, well, what does this mean for us? And so everyone has said with ASEAN centrality, which in other words is the way of saying that ASEAN is still going to be an important focus of attention and a desire to work together. Then the ASEAN countries actually came up with their own Indo-Pacific strategy. India has a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. It really needs to update that because they're worried that a number, China and others, have used a backdoor through ASEAN to flood their own country, India, with products. And Japan works closely with ASEAN. So there is the hope that these arrangements will increase. When I was ambassador, India has an annual Republic Day, and one year they invited all of the ASEAN leaders to come to that because they do see themselves in India as a leader of other countries in the global south or elsewhere, and they've made a concerted effort to enhance their relationship with the ASEAN countries, as I know the Japanese are trying to do as well. The last question was on the private sector. What's interesting is a lot of the issues that are being focused on in the Quad and what you do in government is run by the private sector. There's a great desire to see if the Quad countries can work together in developing some of the emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and cybersecurity. And this is done by the private sector. It's not done by government people. So what is really happening now is an effort to work in conjunction with private sector groups to understand how government can facilitate their greater cooperation. And that's why you see almost side by side with government activities, private sector groups meeting. And I was over in India recently, the US Secretary of Commerce was there. There was a CEO forum. They're setting up for critical emerging technologies, parallel private sector groups of investors who could work in this. So there's a great realization also that even in finance and for the climate change, this is something that I've been discussing with the Indians in their chairmanship of the presidency of the G20. They're trying to focus on raising money for a climate change fund for the less developed world. And the commitments to date have been for a government fund, but government can only provide a minuscule amount of the total capital that's needed. It really is sitting in the private sector. And so how do you do what's known as blended finance, where the government money is used to de-risk what the private sector would put in? Because some of these investments take a great amount of risk, but if the government funding can lower that risk, then private sector money can come in and do a lot more over time in all of these areas. So there is a great interplay between the private and public sector.
Well, I think there's no question that we could go on and on and on with some a very interesting dialogue. We do have refreshments and everyone is warmly welcome to join, but let's thank Ambassador Justin.